Now we've attached our MP3 file to the podcast episode, we'll move forward and start adding pertinent textual information to the podcast to make it both identifiable and searchable for our intended audience. This is important when we want to make the podcast available from our own site, but even more important when we want to make it available on iTunes or even other specific podcasting hosted websites such as Libsyn or Audioboo. Anyway, here, so that we better understand how our podcast is assembled and how it gets disseminated to the internet, let me explain the two terms, feed and episodes. Initially, we have a feed, and this is made up from episodes, and an episode will contain the audio file you choose to associate with it. Now remember, we linked the MP3 worked on so far to episode 1 in the previous tutorial. But there is other information we need to include too. This textual information is known as metadata, and this is simply text entered by us into the podcast that will describe and help identify our podcast and its related episodes. Common metadata will include the podcast title and description, plus, if desired, iTunes extensions. We have to include metadata because the MP3 file itself won't contain any textual information, well, none other than the file name. We also need to include the relevant web link by stating the URL address of where the podcast will be hosted. So let's go about doing this now. We start by selecting the Main tab, if it's not already selected, and then come down to the lower pane to select Feed. As a consequence, we can now enter the title in this title field up here, just underneath these three tabs, Main, Extra, and iTunes. I'll name this Parallel. Now we get to fill in this larger description field. I'll describe this podcast as a talking book podcast of the novel Parallel Circles by Mark Struthers. As you'll realise, you can write an awful lot more here, but I'll leave it like this for our example. It might be that I break up my podcast into around 20 episodes, and each episode will be one chapter of the novel, and these chapter episodes could be timed to be published once a week or once a month or whenever. Now, of course, our example is a novel, but from a music perspective, you could create a podcast of important audible information that you'd like to share about your studio. You might extend this to have a monthly podcast of episodes that talk about your latest client recordings, or maybe deals that you've got running, or even local gigs to attend, etc. You could even hook up with other related local businesses such as photographers and advertise their services within your podcast, primarily about your studio. Anyway, that's the principle of what we can do from a music perspective, but seeing as we're working on this audio, let's see what else we can do here. As mentioned, we need to add the website address URL where the podcast will be hosted. Ordinarily, I would host the podcasts on my website. Therefore, the extension for the website address will be .html. However, if you want to make it available so that it's featured on an external third-party website, then you'll probably want to make the extension .xml. That's not to say you can't use the extension .xml for your own website, you can, but for our example, we'll use HTML. So, for our example then, I'll say the podcast is going to be available from my website, and will be inside a folder on this site called Podcasts. So the full URL here will be http://www.studioenergy.co.uk/podcasts/parallel circles. And as I say, I'll make this HTML, but you might want to make this XML. Talk to your web designer about this. This address relates to where the podcast will reside on the server and uploaded via FTP. We'll look at uploading later. Now, it's often a good idea to include an image, but you don't have to. I'm not going to bother for our example, but you would use this field should you want to. Lastly then, for this tutorial, I'll mention this publication date and time field. Leave it as it is, or change if you plan to publish at a later time. Now, I'm going to leave the checkbox checked here, where it says as most recent episode, but unchecking it allows you to adjust this, as you might feel more appropriate to a different date. Anyway, in the next tutorial, we'll look at entering the necessary data for the episode section that we've created and attached the MP3 to.